Hey everyone, welcome to our fourth video, which is about reading. We're actually filming under the most turbulent of weather conditions, and every storybook goes, it's a dark and stormy night, and that's the conditions that we're filming under right now, which is very rainy and stormy. But in any case, right, so Unsu, today we're going to talk about reading, and I guess the first thing we should ask to start our conversation is, why do we even want to talk about reading? Both of us are readers, and I know you've got a voracious habit or appetite for reading. So tell us a little bit about why you love to read.
Yeah, I think those close to me would consider me a reading addict. I'm constantly reading. Even as a kid, I would love taking a book out, even when we went out to read. For me, reading is like being able to enter different worlds. Every book is a portal into someone else's perspective, way of looking at things. I love reading both fiction and non-fiction, so it doesn't matter whether it's something that's made up or something that's trying to talk about the real world. It's still like a world that you can explore.
Yeah, for me, when it comes to being immersed into reading, for me, the best example I can think of is actually Stephen King. So, I read his books, and I still have very fond memories of me being on a bus, and I was reading one of his books at the time. It was called Cell, and it was about his take on the zombie genre. And so I just remember sitting on the bus, riding to work, and the bus ride probably would take me about 30 minutes or 45 minutes, but in that time, right, I was literally in a different world. I was just very, absorbed into the world he's described in his novel, and I can remember the characters and the actions that they took, and the drama, and to me, reading provides that kind of benefit. For me, my gut feel about reading now is that everyone reads, but I think it's becoming kind of like a dying art. Because obviously in this modern day era of technology, people are more interested in entertainment, visual entertainment, so films and watching YouTube and stuff like that. But I think reading provides something that's above and beyond all these kind of mediums. To me, I feel that you can watch a movie, and a movie can have a very good story, so it's not necessarily that books can't be worse than that. But it's more about when you read a book, there is deconstruction of a certain dilemma or problem or an issue, whereas a movie may try to resolve it on its own. If they have two conflicting character arcs in conflict with each other, the film solves it relatively quickly, right, in basically less than an hour. But when you read a book, I mean, these characters can be taking years, or when you read a book itself in real time, you could be taking about a week or two to get really immersed into the itsy bitsy, the nuances, the intricacies of these characters and the story, and that makes it much more enriching as compared to just watching a movie. And sometimes I think it leaves a much more deeper effect after you finish the story. Yeah. Do you find that to be the case? Because you're also someone who makes films, and how would you compare that experience of watching a movie and reading a book?
I agree with you. There's the question: if you were to go to a desert island, what are the 5 movies or 5 books you want to have with you? And my response has always been, I would much prefer bringing books with me than movies. I find books I could probably, even though I don't reread books as often as I would like to, but I think some of my favorite books, I could probably reread them quite a number of times in my life, whereas movies, there's a limit to how much I can rewatch the same movie. The other difference, I think, is that when you watch a movie, it's a lot more passive, because you're just sitting there and you're just receiving the images. Whereas when you're reading a book, you actually have to recreate the images in your own mind. So you're a much more active participant in the reading process.
Yeah.
And one more difference is that when you're watching movies, you're watching characters from the outside. So it's really hard to get in depth into their motivations and their internal thoughts. Whereas books can, especially like, fiction narratives can really give you like a window into how a character's feeling and thinking.
So I want to compare a record with you. What book have you reread the most times? Yeah, and how many times have you read that book? Think of the book that you read the most, that you keep rereading it.
As I said, I don't reread books as often as I would like to. One of the books I think that I have is Ursula K. Le Guin's Sea Trilogy.
Right.
I think I first read it when I was 16.
Yeah.
And since then, I probably only read it once through again, like the whole thing.
Okay. Okay, Ben, I'm disappointed. No, because for me, right, I'm sorry, I'm going to boast about this. When I was primary 6, so, in primary 6, right, like we always have the school assembly, you're supposed to have a reading session before school starts. So I had one book the entire year, and that book was Jurassic Park. Yeah, and I read it the whole year, I just kept reading it back and forth. Yeah, and I mean, I love dinosaurs, so that's one thing. And like, I don't know, maybe in a very cheeky kind of way, I felt a little bit like, oh, I'm only 12 years old, but here I am reading a huge-ass novel. And I love Michael Crichton, he's actually one of my favorite novels. And just to buttress what you mentioned, like, Michael Crichton has written quite a lot of stuff, right? So besides Jurassic Park, he's written the Andromeda Strain, Terminal, Congo, and there's some other books right now that's, I mean, someone can dig up his huge catalog of books. But I have these very strong memories of reading his autobiography, and I want to remember the title right now. Okay, but I don't remember the title, but it's a book about travels. So the book title could literally be called Travels. And he actually describes this, and it's still fresh in terms of like, I can remember this tale that he provides of him talking to a cactus. Yeah, and Michael Crichton is a doctor, so obviously he's quite practical, or in terms of his disposition, he's quite someone grounded in reality, right, in that sense. But he was very interested in getting involved in this kind of psychedelic type experiences, and I remember him talking about undertaking this meditation type journey, and it involves talking to a cactus. Yeah, and to go along with what you just said, being able to read something like that, it helps you understand the author better, helps you get deeper into his psyche and his inner thoughts and feelings. And this is a bit of a spoiler, but I don't know, it touched me. So just to sum it up very quickly, he talked to the cactus for a long period of time. The cactus did not say anything. He didn't receive any, in his mind, responses. So at some point he decides to end the conversation and he leaves. And according to him, in his head, the cactus said, "It was nice talking to you." Yeah, so it was very profound to me in some sense. Yeah.
Did it make you want to talk to a cactus?
No, but it helped me kind of like get more interested into who he is as a person. And I think the other important point also is that it taught me something about being open to experiences. Yeah, even though I didn't try anything like that, but if someone like him could draw on being so open to these unconventional practices, and it probably helped him quite a lot in terms of his writing, in terms of his creativity, then it taught me something as well. So that's my takeaway. Yeah.
I'm curious about your year that you spent reading Jurassic Park over and over again. Like, how many times do you think you actually read the book?
So this is a fictitious number, but I like to think I read it about 50 times.
Wow.
Yeah,
okay.
because I really felt like I kept reading the book back and forth. I just couldn't stop. Yeah, and at the time the movie was not out, so it goes back to what you said, right? Like, so of course there is the movie version, but if you read the book, right, it's a lot more dramatic. Things were changed in the movie that was different from the book, and there was a lot more science that went into it. There's a lot more philosophical discussions about the idea of reviving extinct species, obviously. And one of the characters, Malcolm, right, he was the chaos scientist, right? He could expound a bit more on the theory of chaos and evolution, as far as I could recall from the book. And it really helps you understand the whole thesis of Jurassic Park versus watching the book, watching the movie. Because watching the movie obviously is entertaining. It's it's good entertainment, but it's not the same as reading the book and trying to understand the deeper philosophical messages, from having something like that come to life.
And did you feel that on each time past reading it, you got different layers of it? Or what was the experience like for you, like, as you read it the 30th time or the 35th time?
I think by then, no. I think by then, I'm just like, it's kind of like a candy, like your favorite candy or your favorite snack. You're just eating it because you like it so much. So I wouldn't say that by the 30th time I was like deriving more fresh insight. It's just more of the idea that I love it so much that I could read this book over and over again. And to extend this further, right, when I ask myself right now, are there any current books that I'm reading that I could treat with the same kind of fervor? Yeah, I guess there would be, but now my tastes have kind of changed, so it's a little bit more non-fiction than fiction by now. Yeah. What about you? What's your reading habits like if you compare fiction to non-fiction, and how would you describe your takeaways, from reading one genre versus the other genre? Yeah.
I think at the moment I'm probably reading a lot more non-fiction than fiction, just because, as we've talked about in so far in this talk show, I'm concerned about a lot of things in the world, so I'm just trying to learn as much about these issues. But if I hit a certain point where I feel I'm reading too much non-fiction, I feel the need to balance it out, and I want to go through phases where I'm just reading fiction. And a lot of times I think I read fiction for the pleasure of it, and with non-fiction it's more to learn something. But that's a bit too much of a generalization. I think it's more nuanced than that, because I think with both forms there's always a bit of pleasure and a bit of learning about it. Even fiction, right? I would say there's a motive to think, if you're following some character's journey, you're learning something important about life. How you deal with obstacles, how you manage your internal feelings, how you relate to other people. So even with fiction, there's a lot of deep learnings there. And then with non-fiction, I always gravitate towards writers that can write well, where it's just really pleasurable reading what they read.
Yeah,
what they write.
I like that point you made about how even if you read something like fiction, you can still take away something from it, and it can have a profound life lesson. I want to talk about this book actually, because this one did have a real emotional impact on me. So the book is called Johnny Got His Gun. Have you heard of it?
No.
So it's a book written by Dalton Trumbo. It's quite short, and the book basically is a internal monologue, because the character, his name I think is John Bonham. So the book already starts with John, and this is set in World War I. So what has happened is that he's been heavily injured in war, and he comes back to, he's in a hospital, and he's lost all his limbs. He's basically this torso with his head, but he has no eyes, no mouth, no ears. So essentially he cannot communicate with anyone. Yeah, so the whole book is literally about him internalizing what has happened to him, reflecting on his childhood. And this is obviously an American book, so perhaps a lot of the passages, a lot of the content that draws from the American lifestyle, perhaps I can't relate to that since I haven't been there, and I'm not an American obviously, but it's still very polemically written to have a very deep impact when I read it. And basically, essentially the message in the book is a very anti-war message, because at some point towards the book, and I'm not going to spoil too much of it, but he's able to communicate with the doctors, and essentially they've asked him to be used as a showcase, for war. And he had a very different message he wanted to deliver versus what the medical establishment wanted to send. Yeah, and I cried, just reading towards the end, because he was just, it was very emotional, like a vitriolic argument against war. Yeah, and I felt like you just can't get that from a movie. So that's one thing, and this is a very good example of where you can get into someone's head, right? And to your point about nonfiction, so I agree with you. Like, to me right now, I'm also reading a little bit more nonfiction, and I think it's because when I look at my reading habits, I kind of divide it into two sets of action or motivations. So one is obviously entertainment, and the other is research. And with nonfiction, I guess that's where you go to get the research, to get the information, the facts, the arguments about a certain issue. But you're right, I mean, that can be quite dry, and it's not very sustainable, I imagine, for someone to just keep diving into that. So there's a huge role for fiction writers to kind of take, to pull from this nonfiction work and to then deliver a very compelling story and narrative, so that people can find it easier to understand these messages, and ideas.
Yeah, I mean, I'll tell you like one genre in particular that has really impressed me is science writing. I think science writing has gotten so good, like I was never a science student. I mean, I did okay in school, but I was always drawn more to the humanities, right? And really hated like biology and chemistry. But then, later on in life, like maybe 10 years ago, I just happened to start picking up some general science books. And it's like the way some of these writers write, like Richard Dawkins, it's so poetic as well. Like it just got me excited about science. And in a way, I got addicted to it. Like I just wanted to read as much good science writing as I could. And it made me just wish, wow, I wish I had access to these books when I was a student. I would have gotten so much more excited about science.
Yeah, that's a good one, because I also try to, if I need to understand a certain subject, and you're right, science is one of them, right? You can't pick up a textbook. You just got to find this kind of writers that, what's the word for this kind of authors? Popular science, popular. There's a word to describe these people.
Either popular science writers.
Popular science writers, yeah.
General science writers.
Yeah, because they are the ones who essentially end up on the New York Times bestsellers list. They take something that's complex and make it simple and interesting enough for people to understand. Besides Richard Dawkins, is there anyone else that you read that you would recommend also for people who are interested in science?
There's one guy in particular that I'm reading one of his books right now. His name is Neil Shubin, and I don't know. I think he's like a paleontologist.
Right.
So he started out his career excavating for fish fossils, but he writes really well about evolution, and he really makes you understand how our bodies are constructed and what we have in common with the rest of life.
Is there anything that you take away from reading science books like this? Does it change your life in any way? Do you change your habits?
I don't know if it changes my habits, but it actually really makes me appreciate how much there is to learn and explore in the universe. Like there's still a lot of mystery, and it's almost beautiful, like how things are constructed, and also how scientists made their discoveries. That their personal journeys are just as interesting as the scientific discoveries.
Yeah, actually, one good topical issue is the theory of evolution, right? And I find that actually when you talk to people, and I mean in a very general sense, obviously, and when there are questions about evolution, I just feel that people just need to pick up a good book, because it's not so simple as what's in terms of what people commonly imagine. It's just about natural selection. There's so many different types of processes and conflicting ideas even among evolutionary scientists about what exactly goes on and how complex it can get. And like people like us, even though we read these books, like we're not qualified to expound and to explain this, but I find that if I tell someone, hey, pick up a really good book, and you will understand that the theory of evolution is not as simple as it sounds. And I really hope that people would be awed actually by what's the beautiful, diverse, and complex world out there, and might even help them appreciate nature a lot more. So let's talk a little bit about what the state of reading is like, and I put up some data. So I just want to read to you some things to get your reactions. So in the 2016 National Arts Council survey, they found that less than half of Singaporeans read at least one literary book a year. So they count that as graphic novels, poetry, fiction. fewer Singaporeans are reading books, and they say, the common reason is because they don't have enough time to read. And compared to the US has 76% of their people reading at least one book a year. In 2018, there's some promising signs where there's much higher reading rates, and this comes from NLB. But nevertheless, most of the reading literature comes down to magazines, newspapers, and books. So what do you make of that? Like, do you feel like, we have actually a national reading movement, and I've seen maybe a couple of friends engage in it, but what's your take? Do you feel like the people around you in general are reading a lot more, or do you think more needs to be done to promote reading?
I think more could be done to promote reading, but I think it's quite challenging, because I think it comes down to what's competing for people's time and attention. Like, if you look at kids today, I think a lot of them are playing Minecraft or video games, and there's so much content on TV. Like the president of HBO, I think, actually said they're in the business of getting people addicted to their channel. So you're actually dealing with an addiction process, and let's say reading is something that's healthy for you, but it doesn't give you that dopamine fix. So it's going to be quite challenging to move people away from let's say TV shows and video games to reading, but I think it's important, and it's something we need to figure out how to do.
And the reason, besides this technology is competing for people's attention, there's also the idea that has been expounded by Nicholas Carl, right? The shallows. So what Nicholas Carl has discussed, or what he argues, is that reading has evolved and changed in a very different form compared to hundreds of years ago, where we don't have like the internet with its hyperlinks, with its advertisements, and lots of little pop-ups. Obviously, all these little nuggets of all these little nuggets that essentially try to compete with your attention, even when you're trying to read an article online. And Nicholas also, he's kind of like opining that it seems more and more difficult to sit down and to be absorbed in a book and just sit for hours. So I think to some degree we have to attribute like one of the causes for this decline, or this inability to just sit and to be focused for long periods of time, is due to us being immersed in this whole new world of hyper quick, what do you want to call this? Hyper quick technological, just technological devices, because trying to reach out to us and catch our attention. And I think that's a hard problem to resolve. I feel like in some sense people just have to be deliberate about it. They have to set aside a certain time within their week. It could just be an hour per week, but the idea is they need to be away from the computer, away from the emails, away from the TV, and just look at a book and just kind of like have a certain resolution to just finish the book, because I don't feel like there's any other way around it. Do you apply such habits for yourself? What's your reading habits like actually? When do you find time to read?
Throughout the day, whenever I can find a chunk of time, my default is to think about the book that I want to start reading. And I did try at one point to do what's called a digital Sabbath, which means on Sunday I just turn off my phone, don't look at my computer, actually read like a physical book. And I did find at the end of the day that there were beneficial mental effects. Like, I felt calmer, I found that I enjoyed the process of reading more, less distracted. It's almost like a form of meditation. So I would highly recommend that as a practice, but as with anything, it's getting started. I think like whether you're trying to exercise or eat well, it's always difficult to motivate yourself in the beginning, but once you get going, I think it's quite useful and helpful.
To relate to that, for me, I've had some friends, so sometimes I would post up like book reviews on my Facebook. Sometimes when I get really like blown away by a good book, I would write like a short review and put them on my Facebook. I would take sometimes passages and copy and paste and just share it with my friends. So I have friends who have asked me like, hey, how do you find time to read? And how I usually try to answer them is that I think if you set yourself up for a huge task, like, okay, I'm going to read 3 books or in 2 weeks or something like that, like it's maybe too much to ask for. And I find that what is useful for them is to get to focus on one book and pick a really good topic, because everyone's different, obviously. Someone could be interested in maybe cooking, someone could be interested in nutrition, and just find that one book where the language is accessible and the angle that's coming from the author is appealing. Because if you read the blurb or something, generally that tries to really draw you in and gives you a sense of like what are you supposed to expect from reading the book. So that advice I found has helped for a couple of my friends. And to add on to that, right, I also think that some people try too hard, because I've also seen on social media people posting up, oh, I'm going to complete 50 books this year, I'm going to complete 100 books this year. That's like their reading list. And honestly, I'm not impressed, because even if you could read a lot of books, but I think there's something to be said about how well have you absorbed what you've read, and how well does it, how well is it ingrained in your line of thought, and whether you can really apply it. When I mean apply, it doesn't mean that you got to do something physically, but how well does it relate to your life, and how you're able to improve your line of thought, essentially, from that kind of reading. So if you read one good book, but you draw a lot out of it, I think that's much more beneficial as compared to reading thousands of books or something like that, and not getting anything out of it, essentially. Yeah, that's kind of how I've approached it. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's quality, not quantity.
Yeah. The other thing that I wanted to mention is that, so I want to ask you this term. Have you heard of it? Tsundoku?
It sounds familiar, but I can't remember what it means.
So Tsundoku is basically a Japanese term to describe someone who collects too many books than what they can finish.
That's me. Guilty as charged.
Yeah. So how do you deal with that, man? Like, do you ask yourself why you're spending so much on books, or do you feel like you've got a lot to catch up on? Yeah, how do you find yourself grappling with all this literature that you're supposed to complete?
I can't remember which author wrote about this. Could be Umberto Eco, but it was basically saying that don't feel guilty about having all these books that you don't have time to read, because just knowing that they're there, seeing it on your bookshelf, or these days I have so many books on my Kindle, so it's just a list on my Kindle, but it's actually just a reminder of how much there is to know and how much you don't know, and yeah, I kind of think that's an okay way to look at it, and also I justify it to myself because my own mind works in a very free associative way. I'll never know during the course of a day what thought comes into my head, and then I'll kind of I sort of have a pretty good memory of, books are like containers, right? And I kind of have a good memory of what's in different books that I have. So I might have a thought that will trigger me to look up that book and find a specific passage and go, oh, okay, this is what that person said, right? So I like having that
it's
ability,
like a library.
To access, instant access, right? But I do feel that I read a lot of books which I start and I don't finish, and that's something I'm struggling with. And I think that's an interesting question for everyone to ask themselves: how important is it to finish a book? Is it okay to start a lot of books and then you get bored with it and you move on to the next one? And for me, I like to keep a list of books I've actually finished from front to back. And in a way, it's a useful way to motivate me to finish books, because I just want to see that by the end of the year, I want to see that there's a decent list of books that I've actually finished.
Do you find that sometimes when you can't finish a book, it's because the content has become too technical, dense, maybe the writing has become a bit turgid, and it's hard to have the same excitement in trying to read towards from the middle to the end? Do you find that's perhaps one of the issues?
Yeah, I think our brains are hardwired for novelty. So when you're starting a book for the first time, it's like the novelty of it, really like excites you. And as you go through the book, especially for nonfiction, a lot of times the later chapters are just elaborations or more examples of the primary thesis. And so there's a part of me that maybe thinks, okay, I've kind of understood the basic worldview or perspective of this book, and I always crave new experiences or new perspectives, and so I think that's what makes me move on to the next book.
Yeah, I share with you those sentiments as well. I think that probably explains why also sometimes I have a habit of not finishing books. Sometimes also because if I see like the book is very long, like 300 or 400 more pages, it gets really hard to reach towards the end, reach towards the finishing line. So, I may go up to like half of the book, and I really am just kind of getting the gist of it already, so I can just go straight to the conclusion. So I think that's sometimes the reasons why I also can't finish a book. Yeah. So I want to just kind of end off with something that's a bit controversial. So do you think there are limitations as to what reading can deliver? So can reading, perhaps, let's put it this way, can it solve social issues? Can it solve a life issue? Can it solve a psychological trauma, for example? What do you think?
I think that reading is a skill that evolved later on, and in fact it is not primary to our existence or even how we think and feel. So lately I've been trying to listen to more audiobooks, and there's a lot of research the difference between oral cultures. Like back in the day before reading, like people would just sit around a campfire and tell stories. And then literary cultures, when the invention of writing came about and people started reading. And oral cultures in some ways are more like communal, and there's this sense of knowledge as like something that's collective. And reading in some ways, I don't think it's an absolute good. I think it's just like just one more activity that we can add, but I wouldn't want it to eclipse other things.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. So I wanted to bring it up because it goes along with what you just said, which is from this book that I read. So it's called The Socrates Express. It's a philosophy book that's written by Eric Weiner. So he actually goes through the story of Mahatma Gandhi, and did I say that right? Yeah. Okay.
Muhammad
Cool.
Gandhi,
Yeah. So so what he actually shared was that as important as reading is, but someone like Gandhi didn't actually read very much. I'm quoting from the book here. Some biographers have noted Gandhi's lack of interest in the arts. He rarely read a novel or went to the theatre or an art gallery. He enrolled for a dance class in London but had no rhythm. And a journalist asked Gandhi for a summary of his philosophy, and he struggled to answer before saying, "I am not built for academic writings. Action is my domain." And that struck a chord with me as well. Like, as much as in this video, obviously, we're talking about the virtues of reading and the benefits of it, but I do think there are certain limitations. Yeah. Another thing that kind of made me realize also the limitation of reading is when I saw this. So I saw this from a tweet. So it's something on Twitter. It came from a leftist activist. I just can't remember who it was, not right now. But essentially, the person argued that if you think that giving someone, say, if you want to introduce someone to leftist thought or something like that, and if you think that by giving that person a reading list of critical theory and leftist thought, you think that's going to solve the problem, it won't. Yeah, and that hit me too. Like I do feel that like people will naturally gravitate to what their natural in the sense of what at least within them they feel they're drawn to at the current moment, and it's very hard to get someone to switch their taste to something that's contrary to their own opinion. It would be like asking someone who's of a religious school try to read the works from another religious school, and naturally that disdain is there. even before you even start trying to get a person to read. So I feel like, yeah, for all said and done, as much as we want to encourage people to read, but I guess there are certain limitations, and we just have to be kind of aware of that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think this will be a theme on the show. We'll always be sort of promoting something, but then it's like there's a caveat.
Yeah, that's right. Well, anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed our video on reading, and we see you in the next one.